He was a golden retriever, silent and trembling, locked behind a fence on a cold winter night, his suffering hidden by wealth and walls. No barking, no crying, just obedience learned through pain. He thought no one was coming. He thought this was all his life would ever be. But walking that quiet street was a former U.S. Marine who refused to look away. And beside him stood a dog who knew exactly what fear smelled like. What happened next wasn't just a rescue, it was a reckoning. Comment where you're watching from. And if you believe God still protects the voiceless, subscribe for a story of justice. Snow fell lightly over the Colorado suburb, thin and dry, barely covering sidewalks, driveways, and the quiet streets of late afternoon. The cold was sharp, but not cruel yet. The neighborhood was one of those places designed to look calm and successful. Wide roads, tall fences, houses that sat far back from the street as if they wanted privacy from the rest of the world. Warm yellow lights glowed behind large windows, promising comfort and safety. Behind one of those houses, comfort had a different meaning. Richard Hale stood in the backyard of his property, his breath puffing out in short, irritated bursts. He was a man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a chest that still suggested the gym routines of his younger years. His hair was dark but thinning at the temples, always neatly combed back, as if disorder offended him. A trimmed beard framed his sharp jawline, more fashion than neglect. Richard wore an expensive winter coat that looked untouched by real use, no salt stains, no frayed seams. He had money, and he liked people to see it. The house behind him, a modern structure of stone and glass, stood as proof of that wealth. His face, however, was twisted with rage. "Sit," he snapped. In front of him near the back fence, a golden retriever stood trembling. The dog was about 3 years old, large for the breed, with pale golden fur dulled by dirt and dried snow. One ear folded slightly forward, the other pinned back, a sign not of playfulness, but fear. His tail hung low, almost touching the ground. The dog did not sit. Richard's lips curled. "You're useless," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Do you know how much you cost me?" The golden retriever shifted his weight paws, scraping lightly against the frozen ground. His dark eyes flicked up to Richard's face, then away again, as if eye contact itself were dangerous. There were faint marks along his flank, old bruises beneath the fur, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Richard stepped closer. "People pay good money for obedience," he continued, pacing like a man delivering a lecture rather than threatening a living creature. "Dogs are simple. You break them, they learn." The dog let out a quiet sound, not a bark, not a growl. Something closer to a breath caught in the throat. Richard's hand tightened around the leash. On the far side of the property beyond the tall wooden fence, dusted with snow, a man had stopped walking. Lucas Miller stood on the sidewalk with his hands in the pockets of his worn winter jacket. He was 34, with the solid, grounded posture of someone who had spent years carrying heavy gear and heavier responsibility. His shoulders were squared by habit, not by pride. A faint scar cut through his right eyebrow, pale against weathered skin that had seen too much sun and too many bad nights. Lucas had the look of a man who didn't try to be intimidating, but often was anyway. His dark hair was cropped short, not stylish, just practical. Stubble covered his jaw, uneven in the way of someone who forgot to shave rather than chose not to. His eyes, a tired gray blue, scanned the street without urgency until they stopped. Beside him, his dog froze. The dog, an older German shepherd with a black and tan coat and a thick, battle-scarred muzzle, had been walking calmly just seconds earlier. Now his ears stood straight, muscles taut beneath his fur, his paws planted firmly into the snow-dusted pavement, refusing to move forward. Lucas followed the dog's gaze. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. The German shepherd did not bark. He didn't pull. He simply stared at the fence head, slightly lowered nostrils flaring as he drew in the cold air. Lucas had learned to trust that posture. The dog named Ranger was nearly 7 years old. His fur showed streaks of gray around the muzzle, and one ear bore a small notch from an old injury. Ranger had served with Lucas overseas, trained to detect threats long before they were visible. He was calm by nature, loyal to the point of stubbornness, and deeply sensitive to fear, especially the kind that had nowhere to go. Ranger took one step forward, then stopped again. Lucas frowned. He had been out for a simple walk, trying to quiet the noise in his head. Discharge papers still felt unreal. Civilian life was quieter, softer, and somehow heavier. No orders, no missions, just long afternoons and memories that came back when the world got too quiet. He hadn't expected anything to happen today. From behind the fence came a sharp voice. "You don't move until I say so." Lucas stiffened. He couldn't see into the yard, but he could hear enough. The tone wasn't playful. It wasn't training. It carried the brittle edge of control of someone who believed they were entitled to obedience simply because they demanded it. Ranger let out a low sound from his chest. Not a growl, a warning. Lucas placed a hand gently on the dog's neck, feeling the tension beneath the thick fur. "Easy," he whispered. "We don't know what's going on." That was true. It could be nothing. People yelled at dogs all the time. He told himself that as he stood there, breathing in the cold air, watching thin flakes drift down between the bare branches of the trees. Then something hit the snow near the base of the fence. A dark drop. Lucas's eyes narrowed. Another drop followed. Then a third. He stepped closer, boots crunching softly on the pavement. Ranger moved with him, now slow and deliberate, head lowered, as he tracked the scent. The snow here was thin enough that the ground beneath showed through. And on that ground were marks irregular, smeared, as if something had been dragged or stumbled. Lucas crouched. The stains were small, diluted by melting snow, but unmistakable. Blood. His jaw tightened. Behind the fence, Richard Hale yanked the leash hard. The golden retriever's stumbled paws slipping on the icy ground. A thin line of red appeared where one paw scraped against the frozen earth. The dog flinched but made no sound. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, annoyed rather than concerned. "Get up," he said. The dog tried. Lucas straightened slowly, his heartbeat beginning to quicken, not with fear, but with something colder, something older. Ranger's hackles rose. Lucas looked at the fence again, at the clean white snow beyond it, then back down at the faint red marks leading toward the large house. He didn't move. Not yet. He knew this feeling the moment before a choice, when instinct and consequence collided. Back in uniform, decisions had been clear. Orders came down, lines were drawn. Out here, there were no clear lines, just a quiet street, falling snow, a wealthy home, and blood where there shouldn't be any. Lucas stood there longer than he realized, his breath fogging the air, his mind weighing what he knew against what he suspected. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his shoulder lightly against Lucas's leg. Together they stared at the fence at the yard beyond, and at the faint, troubling trail that disappeared into privilege and silence. Lucas didn't go home that evening. He stood across the street from Richard Hale's property, long after the sky had turned steel gray and the streetlights flickered on their glow diffused by the thin veil of falling snow. He told himself he was only waiting for Ranger to settle, that the dog needed time to let the scent fade. But the truth sat heavier in his chest. Something was wrong behind that fence. Lucas started with the nearest house, a modest 2-story, with a wreath still hanging crookedly on the front door. A woman answered after a long pause. She looked to be in her late 50s, her posture slightly stooped, as if years of bending had never quite released their hold. Her hair was dyed a cautious brown, the roots gray and showing. She wore a thick cardigan over flannel pajamas and held the door halfway closed, fingers tight around the edge. "Yes," she asked, eyes flicking past Lucas to Ranger. "I'm sorry to bother you," Lucas said evenly. "I'm walking my dog and heard some yelling earlier, from the Hale place." Her mouth tightened. "Oh," she said. "That." She didn't invite him in, didn't step outside. "Is everything okay over there?" Lucas asked. The woman hesitated, then shook her head quickly. "Richard's loud. Always has been. He pays his taxes, keeps to himself. Best not to get involved." Her voice carried the practiced tone of someone repeating a line they had learned by heart. Lucas nodded once. "Has anyone ever called animal control or the police?" Her eyes hardened, not with anger, but with fear. "Look," she said quietly, "that man is rich, lawyers rich, the kind of rich that makes trouble disappear. You didn't hear that from me." She closed the door gently but firmly. Lucas tried 3 more houses. A young couple with a toddler refused to open their door at all. An older man with a beer belly and a gruff voice muttered that Richard was an ass, but not worth the paperwork. A college-aged renter shrugged and said, "That's just how people train dogs, right?" Each response landed like a small weight, stacking one atop another. Ranger stayed close to Lucas's leg, silent, his head turning slightly toward the Hale property every time a gust of wind shifted the sound. The German shepherd's calm only sharpened Lucas's unease. Ranger didn't react to nothing. He reacted to fear, pain, threat. By the time Lucas gave up, the neighborhood had gone still. Snow dusted the roofs, softening sharp lines, making everything look peaceful. The Hale house glowed warmly behind tall windows. From the outside, it looked like safety. Lucas walked home slowly, boots crunching on ice. He lived 2 streets over in a small rented duplex with peeling paint and a heater that rattled when it worked too hard. Inside, he stripped off his jacket-fed Ranger and sat on the edge of the couch without turning on the lights. The silence pressed in. He told himself to let it go. He told himself he didn't have proof. That calling authorities without evidence could make things worse for the dog. That rich men knew how to twist stories. But the image wouldn't leave him, the dull eyes of the golden retriever, the blood on the snow. Night settled fully. Around 10, Lucas heard it. A sound, faint at first, carried through the cold air like a thread pulled too tight. Ranger's head lifted. The sound came again. Not a bark, not a growl. A low, broken whine. Lucas stood immediately. Ranger was already at the door, body rigid, ears forward. His tail didn't wag. His posture wasn't aggressive. It was alert in the way soldiers were alert in hostile territory, quiet, ready. Lucas slipped his jacket back on and stepped outside. The snow had thinned flakes, drifting lazily now. Sound traveled farther in the cold, sharper and clearer. Lucas moved toward the Hale property again, Heart pounding, not fast, but heavy, deliberate. The whine came from behind the fence, then a thud. Lucas stopped. He waited, breath held, listening. A man's voice cut through the night, sharp and irritated. "Get up!" Ranger's hackles rose. Lucas felt his hands curl into fists inside his gloves. He moved closer, staying on the public sidewalk, careful not to cross any clear boundary. The fence loomed high, its wooden slats capped with frost. Through a narrow gap near the gate, Lucas could see the backyard lit by a harsh floodlight. Richard Hale stood near the center coat open, now Ty loosened a drink in his hand. His posture was loose in the way of someone who felt untouchable. The golden retriever lay on the ground near the fence sides, heaving chest pressed to the frozen earth. The dog tried to lift his head, failed. Richard scoffed. Pathetic. Lucas felt a surge of heat behind his eyes. Ranger let out a low rumble, deep and controlled. "Easy," Lucas whispered, though his own control felt thin. He stepped back before he was seen. Back in the shadow of the trees, Lucas paced, breath fogging hard now. He replayed everything he had learned since leaving the service. The rules, the laws, the thin lines between action and disaster. He thought of missions where intervention had saved lives. He thought of missions where it had cost them. If he went in without proof, Richard could claim trespassing, harassment, training methods. If authorities showed up and left, the dog might pay for it later. Lucas hated that he knew this. Ranger pressed his muzzle into Lucas's thigh, grounding him. "I know," Lucas murmured. "I know." They waited. Eventually, the floodlight snapped off. The yard went dark. The Hale house swallowed Richard whole. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that came after something broke. Lucas stood there, long after the cold seeped through his boots, long after the street fell completely still. He didn't intervene. Not tonight. And that decision weighed on him heavier than any pack he'd carried overseas. Morning came pale and cold. The snow from the night before had hardened into a thin crust, crunching under Lucas Miller's boots as he approached the Hale property from the alley behind it. The sky was a washed-out blue, the kind that promised no warmth, even with sunlight. Ranger walked beside him, leash-loose posture, alert but quiet. Lucas hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dog on the ground, the way his head had failed to lift. The alley smelled faintly of trash and frozen earth. At the far end stood the back of Richard Hale's estate high fence security light, a detached structure that looked like a storage shed or workshop. The building was newer than the house, painted a clean gray, its door slightly warped from weather. Lucas stopped 10 feet away. Ranger halted on his own. The German shepherd's ears angled forward, body lowering almost imperceptibly. Not hunting, not guarding, listening. Lucas stepped closer and peered through the narrow gap where the shed door failed to meet the frame. Inside, the light was dim. Dust floated in thin beams where sunlight slipped through a high window. And on the concrete floor near the back wall lay the golden retriever. He was curled tightly, ribs rising and falling too fast. His fur, once glossy, was matted along the shoulder and flanks stiff with dried blood that darkened the pale gold into rust. One hind leg lay at an awkward angle, toes twitching faintly as if the muscles fired without permission. The dog didn't lift his head. He didn't bark. He didn't even whine. Lucas felt his throat tighten. "Hey," he whispered, not thinking, not caring if anyone heard. "Hey, buddy." The dog's eyes flickered open. They were dark brown, wide, glassy with pain, but they focused. Not on Ranger, on Lucas. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the golden retriever tried to stand. His front paws pushed weakly against the concrete. His back legs failed him. He slid forward instead, nails scraping softly, body dragging an inch closer to the door. Ranger let out a low, aching sound. Lucas swallowed hard and took a step closer. The shed door creaked. Richard Hale's voice cut through the space like a blade. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lucas straightened slowly. Richard stood just inside the doorway now, tall and relaxed, wearing fitted jeans and a heavy wool coat. His hair was neatly styled beard, trimmed to a sharp line that made his smile look deliberate when it came. He looked well rested, annoyed but not surprised. "You lost?" Richard asked. Lucas met his eyes. "Your dog's hurt." Richard glanced down at the golden retriever like one might look at a scratched car door. "He's fine. He can't stand." Richard scoffed. "You ever train a working animal?" Marine Lucas didn't respond immediately. "Yes," Richard continued smoothly, stepping closer. "I know who you are." Ranger gave it away. His gaze flicked briefly to the German shepherd. "Discipline isn't cruelty. Pain teaches limits." The golden retriever tried again to move, failed again. His body shook not from cold but from effort. Lucas felt something inside him shift. "You're bleeding him out in a shed," Lucas said. His voice was controlled, but the edges were sharp. "That's not training." Richard smiled thinly. "It's my property." The word landed heavy. Lucas took a breath. Animal control would disagree. Richard's eyes hardened just for a second. Then the smile returned. "Animal control answers emails," he said calmly. "Lawyers answer lawsuits." He stepped closer, invading Lucas's space without touching him. Richard was tall, but Lucas was broader through the shoulders built from years of carrying weight that mattered. Still, Richard didn't flinch. "You trespassed," Richard said softly. "You're harassing me on my own land. That's a problem." "I'm standing in an alley," Lucas replied. "For now." Richard's gaze shifted back to the golden retriever. "Get up," he snapped. The dog flinched violently. Not a sound came from him. No bark, no growl, no protest. Lucas had seen this before in villages overseas and detainees who learned quickly that noise invited pain. Silence was survival. "That dog's afraid to make a sound," Lucas said quietly. Richard laughed once. "Then he's learning." Ranger's low rumble deepened. Richard noticed. "You keep that mutt back," he warned. "One step forward and I call the cops. I'll say your dog threatened me." Lucas tightened his grip on the leash. He knew Richard meant it. "I'll be reporting this," Lucas said. Richard shrugged. "To who?" Lucas didn't answer. Richard stepped back and reached for the door. "Now get off my property before this becomes a legal matter you can't afford." The shed door swung shut with a hollow bang. The lock clicked. Silence rushed in. Lucas stood there for several seconds, staring at the seam of the door as if he could see through it by force of will. "Come on," he whispered to himself. He turned to leave. Behind him from inside the shed came a sound so faint it almost didn't exist. A breath, a drag. Lucas looked back. Through the narrow gap beneath the door, a paw slid forward. Then another, slow, trembling, determined. The golden retriever was crawling. Each movement left a shallow mark in the thin layer of snow that had blown in overnight. Tiny streaks, uneven, desperate. Lucas froze. Ranger pressed against his leg body, tense eyes fixed on the door. The paw reached the threshold and stopped as if the dog had given everything he had. Lucas felt his chest ache with something close to grief. He backed away slowly, forcing himself to move, forcing himself not to act yet. But as he turned the corner of the alley, he looked back one last time. The snow by the shed door was no longer clean. It was marked by a trail that led unmistakably toward him and stopped where he had stood. The snow didn't erase tracks anymore. It preserved them. Lucas noticed that the first morning after his confrontation with Richard Hale, the thin winter snowfall no longer softened the ground. It recorded everything. Tire marks, footsteps, dragged lines that stopped too abruptly. He stood across the street with Ranger at his side, hands deep in his jacket pockets, eyes unfocused. The image of the golden retriever crawling toward the shed door had followed him into sleep and back out again. He hadn't dreamed. He had remembered. Afghanistan had smelled like dust and burned metal. Colorado in winter smelled clean, sharp, almost innocent. But the silence was the same. Back then, Lucas had been 24 leaner, harder, with less gray in his beard and more certainty in his chest. Orders came through the radio in clipped tones, clear, final. There were days when following them meant walking past people who were still breathing, and there had been one day, one moment when he hadn't. A village, a woman bleeding in the dirt, a command to move on. Lucas had disobeyed. He had been reprimanded quietly. No court-martial, just a note in his file and a look from a superior officer that said, "You made us vulnerable." But later in the dark, one of his men had clapped him on the shoulder and said nothing at all. That moment had changed him. It taught him that doing the right thing didn't always look clean, and that the cost didn't always come immediately. Now, standing on a suburban sidewalk with snow crunching under his boots, Lucas felt that same tension pulling at his spine. He couldn't rush this. Ranger shifted beside him, older joints stiff in the cold. The German shepherd's coat was thick mottled black and tan, with a scar puckering the skin near his left shoulder shrapnel years ago. Ranger had slowed since the war, but his eyes were still sharp, still watching. They waited. Lucas began to notice patterns. Richard Hale's black SUV left the driveway almost every morning at exactly 7:40. When it did, the golden retriever did not appear. No walks, no yard time. The shed remained locked. Richard returned late on some evenings, phone pressed to his ear, jaw tight, shoulders rigid. Those nights Lucas heard shouting, not words tone, anger without direction. Lucas learned the rhythm of it. He kept a small notebook in his jacket now, nothing dramatic. Dates, times, observations. Tuesday, 9:12 p.m. Shouting. Shed light on. Dog whine audible for 3 minutes. Thursday, 6:55 a.m. SUV left. Shed door closed. No movement. He took photos from public property only. The shed door, the lock, the snow near the threshold where the golden retriever's paws had scraped weak trails that disappeared after Richard came home. Evidence, not vengeance. One afternoon, Lucas went to the local hardware store and lingered near the bulletin board by the exit. A woman stood there pinning up a flyer for a lost cat. She was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with wind-reddened skin and light brown hair pulled into a messy knot. She wore no makeup, just practical boots and a thick scarf. "Cold enough for you?" she asked casually. Lucas nodded. "Colder than it looks." She smiled faintly. I'm Sarah Collins, he introduced himself. I live a block from the Hale place, she said, lowering her voice. You do too. Right, Lucas hesitated, then nodded again. Sarah's eyes flicked around the store, then back to him. You're not wrong, she said quietly. Something's off over there. Lucas didn't respond immediately. Sarah continued, I teach 3rd grade. You get a sense for fear after a while. Kids bring it to school in their backpacks. Animals do the same thing. She swallowed. That dog. He's scared. Lucas felt a small shift inside his chest. You've noticed he asked. Sarah nodded. I hear things at night. I called animal control once. They came knocked left. Her mouth tightened. Money makes doors close. Lucas wrote her name down, asked for her number, not to act yet, but to remember he wasn't alone. That night, Richard came home furious. Lucas heard it from his kitchen. Ranger's ears lifted before the sound even registered with human hearing. A door slammed. Glass shattered. Richard's voice rose sharp and fast, like a blade striking metal. Lucas stepped outside, breath-clouding phone in his pocket, recording audio. He didn't aim it, didn't move closer, just stood on the sidewalk and listened. The golden retriever made no sound. That frightened Lucas more than screaming would have. An hour later, silence fell again. Lucas reviewed the recording. No clear words, but the rage was unmistakable. The cadence of someone who needed an outlet. And Richard always found one. Lucas closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold window glass. He knew what came next in these stories. Escalation. People like Richard didn't stop when they weren't challenged. They refined. They controlled. They justified. Lucas looked down at Ranger, who lay on the floor, now head resting on his paws, eyes open. I won't miss the moment, Lucas said softly. Ranger thumped his tail once. Outside, snow began to fall again, not thick, not forgiving. Just enough to remember what happened on it. The snow fell wrong that night. It wasn't heavy enough to blind, not violent enough to scare people indoors. It drifted down slowly, glowing amber, under the streetlights, soft and almost beautiful. The kind of snow people remembered fondly. The kind that hid danger instead of announcing it. Lucas woke just before midnight. He didn't know why at first. No noise, no dream. Just a sudden sharp awareness that pulled him upright in bed, heart already beating faster than it should have been. Ranger lifted his head at the same moment, ears angled toward the front of the house. Then the sound came. A dull impact. Wood against something softer. Lucas swung his legs out of bed and pulled on his jacket without bothering to zip it. Ranger was already at the doornails, clicking once against the floor before going still, as if he knew better than to make noise. Outside, the air smelled of alcohol and cold metal. The Hale property was lit up like a stage. Floodlights burned harsh white against the snow, throwing long shadows across the yard. Lucas stayed on the sidewalk phone, already in his hand, recording not video, just audio. He had learned the hard way that shaky footage meant nothing in court. From inside the shed came the unmistakable sound of violence. Not shouting, impact, a thud, a sharp intake of breath, another impact. Lucas closed his eyes for half a second, grounding himself the way he had overseas. Breathe in, breathe out. Control before action. Ranger's body was rigid now, muscles tight, tail low. A low, involuntary sound vibrated in his chest, restrained, but furious. The shed door burst open. Richard Hale stumbled out, coat half-button tie gone face-flushed red from alcohol and rage. He held a bottle loosely in one hand, liquid sloshing near the rim. His hair, usually immaculate, was disheveled, falling into his eyes. His beard looked darker, heavier, casting his features into something rougher and meaner. "Stay down," Richard slurred, turning back toward the shed. "You don't get up until I say." Lucas felt the words like a physical blow. The golden retriever did not appear. There was no sound from inside the shed. Lucas moved before he consciously decided to. He crossed the street, boots sinking slightly into the fresh snow, stopping short of the property line. He raised his phone higher, angling it toward the open door, letting the audio capture everything. Richard took another swig from the bottle and dropped it into the snow glass, shattering. "Stupid animal," he muttered. Lucas dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Lucas spoke calmly, clearly. "I'm reporting ongoing animal abuse at 214 West Alder. The owner is intoxicated. There's an injured dog. I have audio." Richard froze. Slowly he turned. His eyes found Lucas across the yard. For a moment, the drunken haze cleared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You," Richard said softly. He straightened, squaring his shoulders, smoothing his coat, as if muscle memory alone could restore control. He glanced back toward the shed, then at the street, noticing the absence of any audience. By the time the police cruiser arrived, lights off tires crunching softly over snow, Richard had changed. He stood at the edge of the driveway, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed. The shed door was closed again. The floodlights were off. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of the car first. He was in his early 30s, average height, clean-shaven, with tired eyes, and a polite, practiced expression. The kind of man who believed in procedure because chaos was exhausting. "Evening, Brooks," said to Richard. "We got a call about noise," Richard smiled. "Must have been a neighbor, had a few drinks, dropped something in the shed." Brooks nodded, already halfway convinced. He turned to Lucas. "Sir," Lucas handed over his phone. "I recorded audio." Brooks listened. His brow furrowed slightly, but when the sound stopped and no clear words remained, his shoulders relaxed. "Sounds like an argument," Brooks said carefully. "I don't hear a dog." Lucas stared at him. "That's the point." Brooks hesitated, then sighed. "Sir, without visible evidence or the animal present, there's not much I can." A second officer stepped out of the cruiser. She was older than Brooks, mid-40s, with silver threaded through dark hair, pulled into a tight bun. Her face was lined not from age, but from attention. Someone who watched details. Her name tag read, Officer Maria Alvarez. She didn't speak immediately. She looked at the snow, at the broken bottle half buried near the shed, at Lucas's clenched fists, then at Ranger. Ranger met her gaze without blinking. "Where's the dog?" Alvarez asked. Richard's smile thinned. "Inside, sleeping." Alvarez walked toward the shed without asking permission. Richard stiffened. "Hey!" She stopped at the door and listened. Nothing. She opened it. The golden retriever lay on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. His chest moved shallow and uneven. Blood darkened the fur along his sides, still wet. Alvarez inhaled sharply. Behind her, Brooks swore under his breath. Richard took a step back. Lucas didn't move. Snow continued to fall golden under the lights, settling on his shoulders as he stood there, knowing something inside him had finally crossed a line it could never return from. Dawn came thin and colorless. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle quiet that made every sound feel louder than it should have been. Snow clung to the edges of the street in uneven patches, no longer beautiful, just cold and exhausted like everything else. Lucas was already awake. He stood at his kitchen table jacket on boots laced Ranger, watching him with steady eyes. The notebook lay open beside a printed stack of photos, timestamps circled in pen. Audio files queued on his phone. A text thread from Sarah Collins sat open on the screen. I heard him again around 4:10. The shed light came on. Lucas exhaled slowly. This was the moment where hesitation became harm. He stepped outside as the sky began to pale, the air biting his lungs with every breath. Ranger moved at his side, calm and focused the way he had always been before something mattered. The Hale driveway was empty when they arrived. Richard's SUV sat crooked near the garage, frost glazed across the windshield. The house itself looked dormant, lights off, curtains drawn. But the shed door was open, and the golden retriever lay just outside it. He was half on the concrete, half on the snow body, angled, as if he had tried to follow the warmth and failed. His fur was stiff with dried blood, chest rising in shallow, uneven motions. One eye was open, unfocused. The other was swollen, nearly shut. Lucas stopped a few feet away, lowering himself slowly so he wouldn't startle him. "Hey," he said softly. "You're okay. You're not alone." The dog's ear twitched. That was all. Behind Lucas, a car door shut. Sarah Collins stood at the edge of the sidewalk, wrapped in a long coat, her hair loose, now pale against the dawn. Her face was drawn tight, eyes red not from cold, but from having watched too much and waited too long. "I called animal control again," she said quietly. "They're on their way. And Officer Alvarez, she told me to call her directly." Lucas nodded. "Thank you." A voice slurred from the house. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard Hale staggered onto the porch, wearing the same coat as the night before, his bloodshot jaw clenched. The arrogance was still there, but thinner now, stretched over exhaustion and panic. "That dog's mine," Richard snapped. "Get away from him." Lucas didn't move. He lifted his phone instead. "I've documented weeks of abuse," Lucas said evenly. "Audio, photos, witness statements, public property, time-stamped." Richard laughed, brittle and forced. "You think that scares me?" Another car pulled up behind Sarah's, then another. Officer Maria Alvarez stepped out first, posture, straight breath, steady eyes, already assessing the scene. With her was a woman in her early 30s, wearing a county jacket, Emily Chen, an animal control officer, with sharp features, dark hair, braided tight, and hands that moved with quiet purpose. Emily knelt immediately beside the golden retriever, careful professional. "He's hypothermic," she said, "and injured. We need to move him now." Richard took a step forward. "You don't touch my dog." Alvarez turned to him. "You don't own him anymore." Richard froze. Lucas handed Alvarez his phone. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Sarah stepped forward, then voice trembling but clear. "I'll testify. I heard it. I saw the dog dragged to the shed. I heard the impacts." Another neighbor appeared at the end of the street, then another. People who had looked away before now stood watching, hands in pockets, faces pale. Richard's control began to fracture. "You can't do this," he said, backing up. "I'll sue." Alvarez cut him off. "You're being cited for felony animal cruelty, pending investigation. Any further interference and I will arrest you." Richard's mouth opened. No words came out. Emily and Lucas worked together, lifting the golden retriever onto a thermal blanket. The dog let out a faint sound, more breath than voice, and for the first time, his head turned toward Lucas. Their eyes met. The dog trembled, then slowly pressed his nose against Lucas's wrist. Lucas swallowed hard. At the veterinary hospital, the lights were too bright, the air too clean. Machines hummed softly as staff moved with urgent calm. The golden retriever was carried through swinging doors on a gurney, paws dangling limply but breathing. Lucas stood in the snow-dusted parking lot, knees aching as he finally lowered himself down beside the curb. Ranger sat close shoulder pressed into his side. A few minutes later, Emily emerged peeling off her gloves. "He's stable," she said. "It's going to be a long recovery, but he'll live." Lucas nodded, unable to speak. The vet allowed him one moment. Inside the golden retriever lay wrapped in blankets, IV line taped gently to his leg. His breathing was steadier now. When Lucas knelt beside him, the dog's tail gave a weak thump. Lucas leaned close and whispered, voice breaking just slightly. "No one gets to hurt you," he said. "Not here. Not in this country." The dog exhaled long and deep and rested his head against Lucas's arm. Outside, the first true light of morning touched the snow. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly through a person who refuses to look away, through courage that chooses compassion over comfort, through a life that finally matters enough to be saved. If you believe in God, then believe this: no suffering goes unseen. When cruelty hides behind fences and silence, God is still at work, placing the right people on the right road at the right moment. What looks like coincidence is often protection already in motion. In our everyday lives, we all face our own winters. Moments when it's easier to stay quiet, to keep walking, to say, "It's not my problem." But faith is not only what we pray, it's what we do when prayer asks us to act. If this story touched your heart, let it move your hands too. Share it with someone who needs hope. Comment to speak up for those who cannot. Subscribe to this channel if you believe stories of mercy, courage, and justice still matter. May God bless every person watching this, those who feel small, those who feel afraid, and those who feel alone. May He protect the innocent, soften hardened hearts, and give us the strength to be the answer to someone else's prayer. Amen.